Okay, thank you, Jennifer. And I wish to thank all the people that Jennifer thanked. Some of whom I know, some of who I don't. So thank you to everybody who made this happen and invited me, and especially, of course, Miles Coons and Mimi. So we decided, Diane and I decided that I would sort of cover some historical things and she would focus a little more on the contemporary. So I'm going to do some background things and then we'll have a chance to talk together. So I called this little lecture Praise, Protest, and Subversion, which is really about how writers have subverted both the form and the content of the traditional sonnet. And so I think, is it Rachel who's going to share the screen? You don't really need to. Oh, okay, you all are going to share it now. Okay, there are a couple quotes up there, but I'm going to start with a Wordsworth quote. I need to make this smaller so that I can see my lecture, which is on my screen. And now it's not happening. Let me see if I can figure this out. There it goes. Okay. So, yeah, you'll see the Wordsworth quote there. In truth, the prison into which we doom ourselves no prison is, and hence for me, in sundry moods, 'twas pastime to be bound within the sonnet's scanty plot of ground. From a sonnet by Wordsworth. And so I'm thinking about this because I'm thinking about spatial conceptions of the sonnet. Wordsworth wrote about the sonnet as being both confining, a kind of prison, but also a scanty plot of ground that could be cultivated. And I think those conceptions are both important in thinking about sonnets as confining on the one hand, and on the other, a space where things happen. So when you think about that, you know, one of the things I was thinking a lot about this was sort of the, you know, the role that various people are put in terms of the writing of sonnets. For example, women who started out being the objects of usually thwarted desire to centering their own desire. And that being one way that sort of there's a beginning of the subversion of something in the traditional sonnet form, which is usually written by a man, to an unattainable woman. So right away, the concept of women writing sonnets becomes something different, and centering their own desire rather than being objects of the desire of a male writer. Which is why I love Millay's sonnets and Closer to the Present, Marilyn Hacker, and many other women who sort of center their own experience in the sonnet. So that's one aspect of it that I'm thinking about in this lecture. And the other part of it is sort of the tradition and the ways that different people have expanded and changed the tradition, sometimes quite deliberately, and the way that there's an actually a sort of through line from the beginnings of the sonnet to where the sonnet has come to today, and that there is the white European male tradition of the sonnet is not the only tradition, or rather it's a tradition that has been freaked, extended, subverted, changed by practitioners who came later. So when you think about Terence Hayes's recent book, American Sonnets from My Past and Future Assassin, he was inspired by LA poet Wanda Coleman. She was the one that coined the term American sonnet. And this is the other quote that you have on the screen. So she adapted it to the jazz methods of, as she put it, progression, improvisation, mimicry. Sometime in the late 80s, I reread all of Shakespeare's sonnets, sonnets by Melville and others. All that was left was to work out my criteria. Since jazz is an open form with certain properties, progression, improvisation, mimicry, etc., I decided that likewise the jazz sonnet would be as open as possible, adhering only to the loosely followed dictate of number of lines. I decided on 14 to 16 and not to exceed that, but to go absolutely bonkers within that constraint. Let's see, I think there's more. I have a slightly different quote here. You don't have to scroll down yet for the rest of it, but I'll just read you the rest of what I have. I also give the sonnets a jazzified rhythm structure akin to platter patter and or scat and tones like certain beat writers. I decided to have fun to blow my soul. So that idea of the spatial qualities of the sonnet, and also the idea of, these sort of invasions and redoings and rethinking of a lot of these earlier things. Coleman taking on Shakespeare and Hayes taking Coleman from Coleman. And so, and jazz itself, which of course had not been invented in the Elizabethan period, and how all of these sort of cultural and historical influences start to come into play and to really change this form that is not at all a hidebound form that was invented and has remained static ever since, but very much one that is flexible and changing and growing. And Hayes begins his book with these lines: I lock you in an American sonnet that is part prison, part panic closet, a little room in a house set aflame. I lock your persona in a dream-inducing sleeper hold. I make you a box of darkness with a bird in its heart. So there's Hayes, centuries after Wordsworth, sort of taking the concept of a prison or a narrow plot of ground and making it prison, panic, closet, room in a house on fire, box of darkness with a bird in its heart. I love that. And then in other places, here's some other things he calls it later on. An envelope of wireless chatter, a grave, an orphan's house, the sweat and rancor of a fish and chicken shack, the broken phone booth I passed in the village beside a puddle of what could have been crushed tomatoes. So all of these different ways that Hayes kind of took that scanty plot of ground from Wordsworth and creates a lot of different kind of spaces of both confinement and possibility. And I'm especially interested in Hayes because I did a lot of reading in a book called The African American Sonnet, A Literary History, by a man named Timo Muller. And it's really fascinating to me because it's all about the Black sonnet tradition, which is something that we don't generally, at least as white people, think about. Or even quite acknowledge that in fact there is a whole tradition going on that has been going on from very early times in America with Black writers in response to the white sonnet tradition. And so that's what I want to talk a bit about, with also the implications for other kinds of writing and writers from the margins. So the sonnet was a space that Black writers were not supposed to inhabit, white European, and both white and Black writers, interestingly, found it problematic for Black poets to write sonnets. But there is this incredible tradition that developed, and it's really fascinating to explore some of the ways that Black poets used and subverted and resisted the traditional form. So that tension between freedom and restriction, as soon as you think about slavery and Blacks coming out of slavery and more Blacks becoming literate and learning to write, the idea of the tension between freedom and restriction has obvious parallels, literary parallels, as well as cultural and physical parallels. So here are a couple things I want to say about that I gleaned from this book. This is Timo Muller, the author, speaking. After Reconstruction, mid-19th to the early 20th century, African Americans embraced what was called the genteel tradition, a Black middle class looking for social acceptance. Black writers' sonnets weren't overtly political or, for that matter, passionate, but they found ways to gesture toward fuller selfhood and equality. Just writing sonnets was a rebuke to the image of them as intellectually inferior. That's Timo Muller. So writing a sonnet was a way for a Black writer to show the right world, I'm educated, I can join your ranks. And also a way to assert an interior life, because of course at this time, you know, the common attitude from the white world is that Blacks are inferior, they have inferior intellects and worse. So a Black writer excelling at this form is a way to claim equality. It's a way to say, no, that's not the case. I noticed somebody asked if that's in the text you have, and it's not. But we will be looking at a couple of Black sonnets that are in the text that Rachel can scroll down to when it's time. So just to let you know that, and we'll get to that in a moment. But just keep in mind that this is the way. So even in this quote genteel tradition, where the idea was, you know, that African American and Black writers or Black people are coming into a white world and trying to be, quote, the good Negro, and show that they can join the middle class and become a part of this world. So it's not a time when you can be very bold. If you're writing a sonnet at all, it's already like you're doing something a little beyond what you should be up to. So Black artists and writers, you know, have this as well as, you know, this genteel tradition where it has to be kind of couched or disguised. And I'm going to point you to some poems that I don't have time to read, but I urge you to jot them down, or maybe they can be put in the chat so that people are alerted to them and can read them later, because I can't cover all of the things. But check out this book, The African American Sonnet, A Literary History, if you're interested in really taking a deeper dive into this, because I'm just going to skim the surface in the little time I have. But so even the genteel sonnets of the time would sort of couch things in various ways that on the surface white America could accept, but that actually had some subversive things going on. And one of them I'll point you to that you may want to check out later is Mother Night by James Weldon Johnson, Mother Night. Which is a poem that really is about Black racial empowerment, that pretends to be a sort of allegorical lament. And Genesis, really, it's sort of Mother Night is actually the god or goddess who creates the world, a really radical inversion of the white biblical origins of the world. But but you really have to look closely at it to see that that's what it's up to. So I refer you to that if you're interested in sort of things about that particular tradition. So basically what these writers are doing are trying to find a way to go into the realm that has been considered the white world, the just literature itself and writing, as well as take this particular form that requires a lot of skill and knowledge and intellect to do. And they are taking that and saying, look, I can do this. And so sort of in that tradition, another thing that was very popular, we're talking about post-Reconstruction generally, but going into later into the early 20th century, praise poems, praise sonnets were very popular, tribute sonnets. So what African-American writers started doing was taking this praise sonnet form and writing their own praise sonnets, which were going to look a little different. And so if you can scroll down to Frederick Douglass by Robert Hayden. So what they're doing is they're starting to praise Black heroes rather than white heroes. So right away, you're getting something different, and you're getting this tradition started of praise sonnets for other characters. And this is Frederick Douglass by Robert Hayden. When it is finally ours, this freedom, this liberty, this beautiful and terrible thing, needful to man as air, usable as earth, when it belongs at last to all, when it is truly instinct, brain matter, diastole, systole, reflex action, when it is finally one, when it is more than the gaudy mumbo jumbo of politicians. This man, this Douglas, this former slave, this Negro beaten to his knees, exiled, visioning a world where none is lonely, none hunted, alien. This man, superb in love and logic, this man shall be remembered. Oh, not with statues' rhetoric, not with legends and poems and wreaths of bronze alone, but with the lives grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dream of the beautiful, needful thing. So there's a lot we could say about this poem that I'm not going to say because time is so incredibly short. But I do want to say that, it's a poem that very much looks forward in time and looks toward, that starts out with this certainty that it's going to happen, not if, but when. And when it is so ingrained in the body politic, brain matter, diastole, systole, that it's not going to be just rhetoric. It's not going to be poems and wreaths alone. It's going to be lives. It's going to be generations, future generations, that are fleshing out the dream. And again, there's a lot you can say, but I just wanted to leave you with the concept of the praise poem that Black writers are adapting and taking over, and looking at where the sonnet and where the country might go. It's a very unconventional, quote, sonnet as well. So he's remaking the sonnet as he wishes to remake the society as well. I'll mention as well, in terms of these different kinds of poems being written, this sort of genteel, hyper-coded poem that people may not know, but that Black people are going to know what it's signaling. The praise sonnet, protest sonnets. Another one I want to point you to that I don't have time to read you is Claude McKay's If We Must Die, written in 1919, that begins, if we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. Check out Claude McKay's If We Must Die if you don't know. It's a pretty famous poem from that time, but just a real call to arms. And not only a call to arms, but a little interesting detail here is that it alludes to Shakespeare again. It's funny how so many people go back to Shakespeare. He must have been a good writer, because a lot of people seem to use him as a touchstone. But not incidentally, McKay is also alluding to and rewriting a bit of Shakespeare, Henry V's speech before the Battle of Agincourt, which is about a group of men fighting against a sort of overwhelming odds and winning the battle. So he's not only writing this protest sonnet, but he's also making a very erudite allusion, which again, these are things that at the time would have been rather startling and really, really revolutionary in terms of literary conventions and especially Black writers in a white world. So taking on Shakespeare, changing up the traditional markers and flipping the script. And I think a lot about that idea of flipping the script, as in Mother Night, that I alluded to, where the creator of the world is night and darkness and a mother. And that's the womb from which we spring, not the male god, the father. So finding these ways to interrogate the sonnet, to invade the sonnet, to change it up, that's a tradition that's been going on for quite a while. So you have writers like not only those early writers, of which there were many, also writers like Wanda Coleman, Terrence Hayes, Marilyn Nelson, Patricia Smith, Kimiko Hahn, as well as by other writers who are not at the center of white male, often economically privileged writers. So that also goes to anyone in the margins, anyone who is not a part of the mainstream cultural tradition, finding ways to sort of enter the master's house and change what is there, change what they find there, and make something else out of it. I'm already at 20 minutes, unbelievably. Um, that was so fast. And I wanted to talk about flipping the script on Shakespeare and how I took a couple of my own poems and played off of Shakespeare's poems in order to do something different. I'll take 1 minute more, if I may, to just say you have hopefully the handout, or can be sent the handout that's been given to you. And what I did was take the sort of traditional drama of the Shakespeare story that you can read behind the sonnets, which is a man in love with a younger man. And then there's a sort of love triangle with a dark lady later. I took that script and made it an older woman in love with a younger woman who then later gets involved with a dark male rather than a dark lady. And I will just leave it to you guys to read because the sonnets are in the handout and you can take a look at what I did. They're in my book, Mortal Trash, all 14 of them. 'Cause there's so much more to say, but I am going to give the stage to Diane now to hear what she has to say.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Hopefully. That was fabulous, Kim. And yes, there's so much more. And we'll have some time at the end to talk with each other. And maybe you can read at least one of those flipped sonnets you wrote. I'd sure like to hear one or more. I'll take about 20 minutes to talk about sort of the state of the sonnet right now and what it is I think that is motivating many of us to step into that and other traditional forms. So when Kim and I speak of lipstick on the canon, we mean it as an image of both homage and trespass. So contemporary poets, and I'm speaking right now of American poets, especially those who arrive from the margins or beyond them, make footprints or kiss marks on the form and its traditions. We test the form's limits. We bring our language and experience to it. We thereby develop a relationship with it. So even as the form transforms us in our relationship to language in offering us that compressive force of the 14 lines, we also transform the form and pass it on to the future changed. So in my brief time with you, I want to talk about a few of the contemporary sonnet variations that I've given you in a packet. And I know Kim and I both gave you more than we can manage here, but I want you to have them for later and for your own thinking. One of the first contemporary sonneteers, as Kim mentioned, is Wanda Coleman. And as far as I know, it was Coleman who coined the phrase American sonnet. Gerald Stern wrote a book later called American Sonnets, but that was after Coleman's collection. So her American Sonnets was published in 1994. And as Kim said, Coleman said in an interview, she talked about her notion of the jazz sonnet. And it came to her after a white editor called her poems derisively jazz poetry. And rather than skulk away, Coleman claimed it and made it, in a lot of ways, the center of her poetry life. And Kim read you the quotation from Coleman about the connection between jazz open forms and Coleman's own sense of the open form of the sonnet. And I loved it when she said she doesn't exceed 14 to 16 lines, but she goes bonkers within that constraint. And I love this idea of one aspect of the American sonnet being that within chosen restraints of the traditional form, you can go bonkers and blow your soul. So I'm gonna read for Rachel here. It's American Sonnet 95 by Wanda Coleman. Seized by wicked enchantment, I surrendered my song. As I fled for the stars, I saw an earth child in a distant hallway crying out to his mother, "Please don't go away and leave us." He was, I saw, my son. Immediately, I discontinued my flight from here. I see the clock tower in a sweep of light, framed by wild ivy. It pierces all nights to come. I haunt these chambers, but they belong to cruel, churchified insects. Among the books, mine go unread, dust-covered. I write about urban bleeders and breeders, but am troubled because their tragedies echo mine. At this moment, I am sickened by the urge to smash. My thighs present themselves, stillborn, misshapen wings within me. So you see her working with aspects of the sonnet in terms of number of lines, in terms of rhyme sounds, without doing a particular regularized rhyme scheme. Suddenly she gives us flight and light, for instance. So she reminds us, and I think this is characteristic of the contemporary American sonnet, she reminds us of the aspects of the sonnet that the tradition, I guess, but she also, goes bonkers within it. I think it's really interesting that this sonnet is a kind of visionary, a vision that the speaker has. And it creates all the space within a form that is known for its lack of spaciousness. And there's this theme that you see in Coleman's interviews and in the poems of being ignored and enraged by being ignored. So, the books of mine go unread, dust covered, and then I'm sickened by the urge to smash. And that last line, the last two lines, that my thighs present themselves stillborn, misshapen wings within me. So this image of kind of constricted and unacknowledged flight and coming in, and this is very real for Coleman. If you look back at sonnet anthologies and at general anthologies, so often Wanda Coleman's work is not included. And so that feeling of sort of always being marginalized comes through in fury in many of Coleman's poems. Good for her. So Gerald Stern sonnets, as I said, they aren't 14 lines. They tended to be from 16 to 23 lines. There are commas, but not periods usually. So there goes that. And rather than rhyme, Stern often used anaphora, the repetition of phrases at the beginnings of lines to sort of gas up the poem's engine, along with mad enjambments. I'm not going to read Stern's poem Egg, but read it, and even better, listen to him read online, because it's so great. And when I think about him, I ask this question, this building question in me: what is American about an American sonnet? Maybe it's the self-proclamation that it's a sonnet because I say it is. Maybe it's the tendency to nearly burst out of the seams of the form, but not quite. So Patricia Smith, and Rachel, if you could move to Patricia's poem, The Blood Sonnets. Patricia Smith really owns form. She's a contemporary master of form, not just sonnets and sonnet sequences and crowns, but hustles and pantoums and sestinas and everything else. And Smith often practices those given forms by holding closer to their traditional structures and moves than some other practitioners. But Smith blows them open with the power of her own claimed autobiographical and cultural observation material. In the poem that I've given you here, she doesn't just blot her lipstick on the form, she bloodies it. And I'll just read the first section from the Blood Sonnets. So the Blood Sonnets are 3 sonnets, and this is the first. Me, age 12. Sure that I was dying, that I died, that the gush of iron smell and black thick splash signaled all my sin gone wide, I pried open the thin, wobbly back of a record cabinet and crammed underwear inside. My mother had told me nothing about my body, damned to swell, sprout hair, creak, and bleed toward old. So I hid the stuff, soiled Carter's there among the music, wedged wrong in all that bladed jazz and blues I didn't dare dance to. Gangly child, I was still small, but too plumped to rest in my mama's lap. Stashing my music, I braced for her slap. Look there at what a sonnet can do. And, it's a perfect sonnet. Look at the rhyme scheme: dyed, black, wide back, crammed, told, damned, old, etc. And that slap of a couplet with lap and ending with slap. And this incredibly brilliant image of stashing her bloody underwear in with the music. So not only is her blood stashed, is her, supposed shame stashed, but with that stashing, her music is stashed away too. Just really an incredible achievement, that sequence, and all of hers. Okay, so Evie Shockley, and if you're interested in contemporary form, you got to read Evie Shockley, especially Evie's book, The New Black. She, like Cummings, like Lucille Clifton and Sonia Sanchez, Evie often eschews capitalization in her poems and seems to activate the sonnet for what seems to be very different purposes. And I think this is really a crucial poem, and I hope people have time to look at it further, but I am going to read it because I think it's pretty central. My last modernist poem, number 4, or Re-rebirth of a Nation. And it is a sonnet, even with that line there. A clean-cut man brings a brown blackness to a dream-carved, unprecedented place. Some see in this the end of race, like the end of a race that begins with a gun, a finished line we might finally limp across. For others, this miracle marks an end like year's end, the kind that whips around again and again, an end that is chilling with a lethal spring coiled in the snow. Ask Lazarus about miracles. The hard part comes afterwards. He stepped into the reconstruction of his life, knowing what would come, but not how. Okay, so with Shockley's poems generally, I really feel like I have to just go back in and interrogate each word and phrase, and sometimes do research. So the title, my last modernist poem, number 4, our re-rebirth of a nation, suggests a cycle of revisiting the same issues from modernism's gravitational pull to the black hole of the racist film Birth of a Nation. So Shockley's poem was written after President Obama's first election. Remember how we all felt? And Shockley prophetically cautions against viewing the election of his brown blackness as signaling the end of race. Every phrase in the poem alludes to history. Dream carved, I'm sure you felt that, representing Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, that carved a path for Obama's election. The double use of race, the end of race that begins with a gun, referencing King's assassination and Malcolm X's assassination, the violence that leads us to this moment, and a foot race that likewise begins with a gun. The spring also has a double use, the seasonal kind that whips around again and again, like modernism, like Birth of a Nation. And then the lethal spring coiled in the snow, waiting to be unleashed. Then she calls attention to the poem's volta by drawing a typographical line after the very first 10 lines. And what's below? Lazarus, the biblical dead man resurrected by Jesus. Ask Lazarus about miracles. The heart part comes afterwards. I think we've learned, have we not, that resurrections cycle back to death. She draws on the archetype of the risen man to bring mythic history to the present moment. So there are some sound rhymes, race and place, and alliterative echoes. But the more important rhyming in this one is the use of homonyms and double or triple word usages and allusions. The sonnet was built to think and rethink. Often the volta is signaled by a word like, still, yet, therefore, however. So there's that turn, that moment of rethinking to pose a thesis and then revise it within the frame of the little song. Its original purpose was to posit a problem, represent a turn in the thinking, and come to a shift or change via that delicious rhyming couplet. So it's really the ideal package for Shockley to reinterpret an historical moment that was busy being interpreted in conventional culture as the end of race. Ask Lazarus. So Kim talked quite a bit about Terence Hayes' collection, American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin. And whereas Shockley responds to the election of President Obama, Terrence Hayes is responding to the election of President you-know-who. And actually, one of Terrence Hayes' primary influences was indeed Wanda Coleman. Here he is quoted in the New York Times. As a person raised by a soldier and a prison guard, it would make sense that I would like boxes and structures a little too much. In fact, his second book is titled Wind in a Box. To me, a perfect image of what a poem can be. And a line in one of his American sonnets, I make you a box of darkness with a bird in its heart. Another, I lock you in an American sonnet that is part prison, part panic closet, a little room in a house set aflame. Another, I lock you in a form that is part music box, part meat grinder to separate the song of the bird from the bone. So there it is, that tension the form can hold. The skeleton that embraces or imprisons the song both, for isn't poetry like a body that houses the soul, but also keeps it captive. The form's compression is an intensifier. So how else does Hayes get to a line like, inside me is a huge black bull, bald, small enough to fit inside the bead of a nipple ring. The form holds him up as he does the dreadful, dangerous work of naming the names of the assassins, from Dylan Roof to John Wilkes Booth to Donald Trump. Okay, so I'm just going to say a few things about my own turn to the sonnet, and then Kim and I can talk. So I turn to the sonnet in gradations. My first addiction was to what Allen Ginsberg called the American sentence, basically an unline broken haiku. So a 17-syllable sentence. One of Ginsberg's, for instance, put on my tie in a taxi, short of breath, rushing to meditate. Or rainy night on Union Square, full moon. Want more poems? Wait till I'm dead. And here's one of mine from a sequence of American run-on sentences that I wrote. Still life with Easter Bunny, 20 caged minks, and rusty meat grinder. So then in my book, Still Life with Two Dead Peacocks and a Girl, in which I was working to intersect still life painting with the place and people who made me in rural Michigan, I decided to write a sequence of American sentence sonnets. So that is 14 lines in which every line is 17 syllables. So I wasn't rhyming, I wasn't metering, I was syllable counting. The restrictions of these sonnets were a kind of madness, right? From a painting about the rural in a poem of 14 lines in which every line is 17 syllables. But what I experienced within that corseting was a weird freedom, a kind of supernatural focus, a relief from the self, and moments of surprise that arose from having to count syllables. So how else might I have come to, at the end of the first sonnet in the packet, art useless as tits on a boar? And actually, the phrase useless as tits on a boar came from my mother and from her father, the barber in the village where my mother was raised. And it was a common phrase. You might say, Harry, he's useless as tits on a boar. And so I became more and more interested in this intersection between, the supposed high culture of the sonnet and the low culture of the people and the diction and the stories of where I'm from. And that followed me then into my most recent collection, Frank Sonnets, which I'll be reading from tonight. And that is a whole book of sonnets that together compose a kind of memoir. So let me just end with this. Learn the form, but seek the formless. That's the silent monk speaking in Jet Li's martial arts film, The Forbidden Kingdom. Don't be attached to form. Don't be attached to formlessness. I think I read that somewhere, but I can't find the text. There is no definitive advice I can give about form. Write the sonnet until it nearly bursts its seams, then kiss it, betray it, crucify it, abandon it, return to free verse, and the pretense that there is such a thing as being free. Just when you think you've got it made, you don't got it made. Once in the middle of rural Ohio at sunset, I said to my then husband who was driving, amazing what a job interview can do for your state of mind, at which point we slammed into the tawny side of a 10-point buck. And I found myself eye to eye with it through the windshield. Our car totaled, our bank account drained, the buck hung up and butchered. And from that point on, everything kind of went downhill. In poetry, you've never arrived in the promised land, or if you arrive, you get thrown out. And if you don't get thrown out, you will get too comfortable and become part of the couch. So I suggest, sonneteers, you do the thing that beckons, like dead Ahab beckoned lashed to the whale's side, and then do that other thing, and then the thing after that, and then maybe return prodigal to the sonnet who has waited centuries for you and loves you still. Thank you. Hi, Kim.
So, this is the conversation that we have with each other. Di, maybe I could start by saying that I read your recent essay in Poets and Writers, and it struck me so much that I just wanted to read it back to you and to everyone, which was, you were talking about organizing your horse statues as a kid. And you said, maybe there is something to kid level to the way in which order and the imagination are not in binary opposition to each other, but feed each other, sugar cubes on an open hand. And I love that. I love when I read that, because I think so often people feel that the way I interpret it, is that, so many people feel that an ordered form, a structured form like the sonnet, is inhibiting to their imaginations, and feel that it's and that craft itself is somehow oppositional to inspiration and imagination. And I think that quote spoke to me because it sort of touched something that I think about a lot, which is that they aren't in opposition at all, and that they are actually both parts of the same whole that need to work together to make the poem. In this case, maybe it's true in other things in life, but that idea of kid level, and that order and the imagination are not in opposition, but actually feed each other. I love that concept. And I think that that's something that really can be applied to not only the sonnet, but all poems.
And even minds and houses, I had to show you, a friend sent me two of the horses after I wrote that. Aren't they cool? I still want to
Yes.
play with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kim, I was so interested in that essay by Emily Dickinson's herbarium and her funky sense of order as she ordered plants and leaves in her collection of them, and how she ordered poems, which was not linear. Nobody still can figure out how she ordered her booklets that she sewed together at the spine. And so, yeah, my thesis in that essay basically is that order is something that's very personal and very interior. And for me, when I apply order to poems like the sonnet, it leads me, the trouble of it leads me to ideas and insights that I wouldn't have had otherwise. My imagination has to leap. And that kind of leads me to wanting to ask you if you'd be willing to read at least one of your Shakespeare flips.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. The each one of them sort of plays off a numbered. They're all numbered and they're numbered the same as Shakespeare's are. So I don't want to take the time to read Shakespeare as well, but if you have the handout of the craft lecture, it's in there. Begins that time of me thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or fall, few do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. I've always loved that.
Damn, he was good.
Oh, no kidding. One of those old dead white guys who is actually as good as they say.
He
You
should have been famous or something.
Yeah, I know. It's too bad nobody reads them anymore or knows about them. So I took off from Shakespeare's, and so that poem 73 about youth and age, there's some things that show up in my poem that are sort of a, sideways oblique response. So here's mine, 73. It's that time of year, ice in the trees, snow like dirty light piled beside the trash bags, city gardens behind chain link fences, mired in white except for an occasional rat. Everyone lately has cancer. Philip Seymour Hoffman is dead of an overdose. Everyone's sad and fascinated. Black night is falling in a song. I prefer the one about the glowworm. Illuminate yon woods primeval. Come to bed, my aeronautical glimmer. Draw a treble clef, a few notes will swoop down. Nothing lasts anyway, and we leave nothing behind.
Will you talk about constructing that, how you see it as a response or a dance with Shakespeare's? And one of the things I notice as I hear it is how contemporary the language is, and yet there's still those cadences that whisper back to the sonnet. So just talk to us about that.
Yeah, I wanted to make it contemporary. That's, I didn't want to write in Shakespeare's language, although I've sometimes borrowed some lines of his. For years I had, one of his poems is, and every fare from fair sometime declines. And in my head for years was, and every airline fare sometimes declines. Which I finally got into I forget which one I got it in, but I did get it in there into one of the poems. But it was really kind of a Vulcan mind meld with Shakespeare. And I was looking for particular poems of his that spoke to me, but that I could also use in some way. And I was trying to recreate a sense of the arc of the drama of the sonnet. So I did the first 8 being about the older woman in love with the younger, and the next 6 being about the dark gentleman rather than the dark lady, who in the dark gentleman is an African American blues musician, so I sort of used that framework in a very condensed way to write a series of 14 sonnets that take on the 154 or however many there are of Shakespeare, trying to light down at certain poems that maybe were somewhat important to Shakespeare's sequence because I was doing a much more compressed version of it. Yeah, so this one just took on, the time of year, the winter, and I gave a contemporary version of, as it happened, New York winter where I was at the time, um, and death and exploring death and the winter of life and later life. Um, and then the fire comes in, the glowing of such fire that the ashes of his youth doth lie sort of came in with the glowworm, and the line from if you listen to the glowworm song, which you can find online, there's a line about the woods primeval, and it becomes an aeronautical glimmer and the sort of invitation to the lover to come to bed, just, so rather than the deathbed that expires, it's still sort of an invocation to the lover to, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. And a little more probably of a darker turn in the sense that, well, nothing lasts and we don't leave anything behind is definitely a darker turn than Shakespeare's. So, it was a little bit of just improvisation like jazz, starting with sort of a melody and then taking it out to wherever I took it out, but trying to bring enough of the chord changes in that Shakespeare makes to, to be reflected in the thing that I wrote.
People are asking on the chat which book these are in.
They're in Mortal Trash, and the section is called The Sonnets.
Okay.
And it really helps if you pull out, your Shakespeare collection or find the Shakespeare poems online. It's kind of fun to go back and forth and see how they interact, because in my book, they're just numbered.
That's interesting, that yours have that pretty distinct interaction with Shakespeare, that can be, now I want to go and write an essay about the comparison between yours and his. And in my book, Frank Sonnets, I'm interacting in certain ways also with the dead white male writer, Frank O'Hara.
Mhm.
So what do you think that's about? Is it lipstick? Are you kissing Shakespeare, or what does that do for you?
I think it is. And I think you're doing the same thing with O'Hara. I mean, you literally in one poem are talking about the lips that kiss the lips that kiss the lips in Frank. It's a fabulous book. And I'm rereading it now. But I read it once and there are certain poems I've gone back to, but I really love the book. It's a beautiful book. And yeah, I think that it's, of course, we build on and respond to and argue with the writers that came before us. And, not only the writers, but the artists, the visual artists and the painters and the makers, as well as the destroyers, of what came before. And to me, I just think of it as the river, that it's all in the river and it's all there for us to dip in and swim with. And previous writers and former makers are very much present to me, and I want to be in dialogue with them because they're very present, and they are the people that left their traces, or they make the river, to go back to that metaphor, this underground river that flows through life, that is not being on hold for an hour, to get your bank account straightened out or whatever, but the underground river that is really the source of life for all of us, that feeds us, and that's the creators. And so I think anytime we have someone, or like you with Frank O'Hara, who is a mentor or a friend, or whether they're in the same physical space as you or the same time zone or time in history as you, they are fellow travelers in a way. And it's nice to reach out to your fellow travelers, and you want to engage with them somehow. So I think that's the impulse behind it.
Yes, I felt when I was first starting to work on Frank that there was almost a stepping in. And I think writers have to be open to that stepping in by reading writers who came before without immediately sort of refuting and judging because of, from their earlier, but to just sort of be open to what they have to teach as well, as to their limitations. Frank walked into the first piece I wrote for that book. And so I just took the hint and read more of him and kind of had a eureka moment that I could have, I could interact with Frank O'Hara's sort of spontaneity of diction, what he called his I do this, I do that poems, that sort of, urban, I'm walking down the street and here's what I see and I'm writing it right now. And so I brought that spontaneity of thought, of sort of the movement of the mind, the movement of the eye to the poems in that collection. So I feel very grateful to Frank O'Hara. And at the same time, there's poems in that book that are really critical of kind of the culture of white male poetry that I came up in the 1970s. One of O'Hara's best friends was somebody that I write very critically about in one of the poems, in terms of his being a predator. And so I think we can hold both truths at the same time. For me, if I don't have a connection to the writers who came before, I feel kind of aimless. And we can choose what traditions we need at a given time, but I need to feel that I have ancestors, even if they don't claim me.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.